The avoidant's deepest nightmare centers around the complete dissolution of their carefully constructed emotional defenses. Their psychological architecture has been built specifically to prevent anyone from witnessing their authentic emotional state, creating multiple layers of protection against genuine intimacy. The thought of someone seeing past their composed exterior to the vulnerable, needy, and emotionally hungry person beneath triggers overwhelming panic that courses through their entire nervous system. Their fear of emotional exposure runs so deep that it affects every aspect of their behavior and decision-making processes. The avoidant operates under the constant threat that someone might discover their true feelings, their desperate need for connection, and their profound loneliness. This terror manifests as an elaborate system of emotional camouflage designed to keep their authentic self hidden from view, even from themselves. The physiological response to the possibility of emotional exposure resembles a fight-or-flight reaction. Their heart rate increases, their breathing becomes shallow, and their muscles tense as their body prepares to either flee or defend against the perceived threat of vulnerability. The avoidant's nervous system cannot distinguish between physical danger and emotional exposure, treating both with equal levels of alarm and defensive mobilization. Their mind creates intricate scenarios of emotional catastrophe that reinforce their need for protection. They imagine being laughed at, rejected, or abandoned if their true feelings were ever discovered. These mental rehearsals of disaster become so vivid and frequent that they feel more real than actual experiences, creating a psychological prison where the fear of vulnerability becomes more powerful than vulnerability itself. The terror of exposure extends beyond romantic relationships to encompass all areas of their emotional life. The avoidant fears that showing genuine enthusiasm might be met with ridicule, that expressing sadness might be seen as weakness, and that displaying anger might be perceived as losing control. This comprehensive fear of emotional authenticity creates a life of perpetual performance where their true self remains locked away. Their emotional immune system becomes hyperactive, attacking any signs of emerging vulnerability before it can fully develop. The avoidant learns to suppress emotional responses so quickly and automatically that they often lose awareness of what they were actually feeling. This creates a disconnect from their own emotional experience that leaves them feeling empty and disconnected from life itself. The fear of being truly known creates a paradox where the avoidant craves the very thing they actively prevent. They desperately want someone to see and understand them completely, yet they cannot tolerate the vulnerability required for such intimacy. This internal conflict generates enormous psychological tension that manifests as chronic anxiety, depression, and a persistent sense of existential loneliness. Their protective mechanisms become so sophisticated that they often fool themselves as well as others. The avoidant develops the ability to rationalize away their emotional needs, convincing themselves that they don't actually want intimacy or connection. This self-deception provides temporary relief from the terror of vulnerability, but ultimately increases their isolation and emotional poverty. The terror of exposure becomes self-perpetuating as the avoidant accumulates more emotional secrets that must be protected. Each suppressed feeling, each hidden need, each unexpressed desire adds another layer to their defensive fortress. The weight of maintaining these secrets becomes exhausting, yet they cannot imagine the alternative of being genuinely known by another person. Their fear extends to the possibility that emotional exposure might reveal not just vulnerability, but also their capacity for intense feeling. The avoidant often suppresses not just painful emotions, but also joy, excitement, and love, because the intensity of these feelings threatens their sense of control. They fear that once they allow themselves to feel deeply, they might become overwhelmed and unable to function. The dread of becoming emotionally dependent. The avoidant's psychological conditioning has taught them to equate emotional dependence with complete powerlessness and vulnerability. Their deepest fear involves losing their carefully maintained independence and becoming reliant on another person for emotional stability and well-being. This terror stems from a fundamental belief that dependency equals weakness, and that needing others inevitably leads to disappointment, rejection, and abandonment. Their nervous system responds to signs of growing attachment with alarm bells that trigger immediate defensive responses. The avoidant recognizes the early stages of emotional dependency and mobilizes their entire psychological defense system to prevent further bonding. They fear that once they allow themselves to need someone, they will become completely at that person's mercy, vulnerable to manipulation, control, and eventual abandonment. The physiological experience of growing attachment feels threatening rather than comforting to the avoidant. As oxytocin and other bonding chemicals increase in their system, they experience anxiety rather than warmth. Their body interprets the neurochemical changes associated with love and attachment as warning signals that they are losing control and becoming dangerously vulnerable to another person. Their mind creates elaborate catastrophic scenarios about what emotional dependence might mean for their survival and identity. They imagine becoming so reliant on another person that they lose themselves completely, becoming a shell of their former independent self. These mental rehearsals of dependency horror stories reinforce their determination to maintain emotional distance and self-reliance at all costs. The fear of dependency extends beyond the relationship itself to encompass their entire sense of identity and self-worth. The avoidant has built their personality around being strong, independent, and self-sufficient. The possibility of needing someone else threatens to demolish their entire self-concept, leaving them without a coherent sense of who they are or what makes them valuable. Their emotional regulation system becomes hypersensitive to any signs that they might be developing emotional dependency. The avoidant monitors their feelings constantly, ready to shut down any emotional responses that might indicate growing attachment or need. This creates a state of chronic hypervigilance where they are always on guard against their own natural bonding instincts. The terror of dependency creates a cruel irony where the avoidant's attempts to remain independent actually make them more dependent on their defensive strategies. They become enslaved to their need to avoid needing others, creating a different kind of dependency that is equally limiting and ultimately more isolating than healthy interdependence would be. Their fear encompasses both the possibility of being abandoned once they become dependent and the possibility of being trapped in a relationship where they have surrendered their autonomy. The avoidant cannot imagine a middle ground between complete independence and complete dependency, seeing only these two extremes as possible outcomes of emotional intimacy. The psychological weight of maintaining complete independence becomes exhausting over time, yet the avoidant continues to bear this burden rather than risk the vulnerability of interdependence. They fail to understand that healthy relationships involve mutual dependence, where both parties support each other while maintaining their individual identities and autonomy. Their nervous system remains in a constant state of alert for any signs that they might be becoming too comfortable or secure in a relationship. The moment they notice themselves relaxing into emotional safety, alarms begin sounding that warn them they are becoming dangerously dependent. This prevents them from ever fully experiencing the peace and security that comes with healthy attachment. The fear of dependency also extends to their worry that they might discover they have been starving for connection all along. The avoidant dreads the possibility that once they allow themselves to experience genuine intimacy, they will realize how much they have been missing and become desperately hungry for more. This fear of their own emotional appetite keeps them in a state of self-imposed emotional fasting. The horror of losing control over their emotional world. The avoidance psychological framework is built on the foundation of emotional control and regulation. Their greatest terror involves the complete breakdown of their ability to manage their emotional responses and reactions. They fear that authentic intimacy will overwhelm their carefully developed emotional management systems, leaving them flooded with feelings they cannot contain or control. Their nervous system has been trained to operate within a narrow range of emotional expression, carefully modulated to prevent overwhelming experiences. The possibility of intense emotional flooding triggers their deepest survival instincts, as their brain interprets emotional overwhelm as a life-threatening situation that must be avoided at all costs. The physiological experience of losing emotional control feels catastrophic to the avoidant. They fear that intense emotions will trigger panic attacks, nervous breakdowns, or complete psychological collapse. Their body responds to the possibility of emotional intensity with the same alarm it would show to physical danger, flooding their system with stress hormones and activating their fight or flight response. Their mind creates vivid scenarios of emotional chaos where they imagine themselves completely overwhelmed by feelings they cannot manage or contain. These mental rehearsals of emotional disaster become so real and frightening that they prefer the safety of emotional numbness to the risk of feeling deeply. The avoidant convinces themselves that emotional control equals emotional health, not recognizing that their control is actually emotional suppression. The terror of losing control extends to their fear of becoming emotionally unpredictable or volatile. They have built their identity around being steady, reliable, and emotionally consistent. The possibility of experiencing emotional ups and downs threatens their sense of who they are and how others perceive them. They fear that emotional intensity will make them appear weak, unstable, or mentally ill. Their emotional regulation system becomes hypervigilant, constantly monitoring for any signs of emerging intense feelings that might threaten their sense of control. The avoidant develops sophisticated early warning systems that alert them to potential emotional overwhelm before it can fully develop. This creates a life of chronic emotional surveillance, where they are always watching themselves for signs of losing control. The fear of emotional intensity creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, where the avoidant's attempts to control their emotions actually make them less capable of handling intense feelings when they do arise. By avoiding emotional experiences, they never develop the skills necessary to navigate intense emotions successfully, making their fears of being overwhelmed more realistic over time. Their terror encompasses both positive and negative emotional intensity. The avoidant fears not just overwhelming sadness or anger, but also overwhelming joy, love, or excitement. They have learned to associate all intense emotions with loss of control and potential danger, creating a flattened emotional landscape where they exist in a perpetual state of emotional mediocrity. The psychological effort required to maintain emotional control becomes exhausting over time. Yet the avoidant continues this practice because the alternative seems even more frightening. They cannot imagine allowing themselves to feel deeply without losing themselves completely, not understanding that emotional intensity can be experienced safely within the context of healthy relationships. Their nervous system remains in a constant state of readiness to shut down any emotional experiences that might threaten their sense of control. This creates a hair trigger response system where they automatically suppress emotional responses before they can fully develop, leaving them disconnected from their own emotional experience and unable to process feelings in healthy ways. The fear of losing emotional control also stems from their terror of appearing needy, desperate, or emotionally hungry in front of others. The avoidant believes that emotional intensity will expose their deep need for connection and love, making them appear pathetic and undesirable. This fear keeps them locked in a prison of emotional restraint where they cannot access or express their authentic feelings. The panic of being truly understood and accepted. Perhaps the most paradoxical fear that haunts the avoidant is the terror of receiving exactly what they claim to want most: genuine understanding and unconditional acceptance. Their psychological conditioning has prepared them for rejection, criticism, and abandonment, but they have no framework for processing authentic love and acceptance. The possibility of being truly seen and loved anyway creates panic rather than relief. Their nervous system responds to genuine acceptance with suspicion and alarm rather than gratitude and peace. The avoidance brain cannot process unconditional love because it contradicts everything they believe about themselves and their worthiness of care. When faced with someone who truly understands and accepts them, their psychological defenses go into overdrive, attempting to reject or sabotage the very thing they have always craved. The physiological response to genuine acceptance mirrors their response to danger. Their heart rate increases, their breathing becomes shallow, and their muscles tense as their body prepares to flee from the perceived threat of being loved unconditionally. The avoidance nervous system interprets acceptance as dangerous because it threatens to dissolve the defensive structures they have spent years building. Their mind creates elaborate reasons why genuine acceptance cannot be real or lasting. They convince themselves that anyone who truly understands them will eventually leave, that unconditional love is impossible, and that acceptance is just a precursor to deeper rejection. These mental gymnastics allow them to reject love while maintaining their belief that they are protecting themselves from inevitable pain. The terror of being understood stems from their fear that once someone truly sees them, that person will discover they are fundamentally flawed and unworthy of love. The avoidant cannot imagine that someone could know them completely and still choose to stay. This fear becomes self-fulfilling as they push away anyone who gets close enough to offer genuine understanding and acceptance. Their emotional immune system attacks expressions of unconditional love as if they were foreign invaders threatening their psychological ecosystem. The avoidant has become so accustomed to conditional love and emotional inconsistency that genuine acceptance feels alien and dangerous. They literally do not know how to receive or process authentic care. The panic of being truly accepted creates a psychological crisis where the avoidant must choose between their defensive strategies and the possibility of genuine connection. This choice feels impossible because accepting love would require dismantling the very defenses that have kept them emotionally safe. They fear that without their walls, they will be completely vulnerable to devastating hurt. Their fear extends to the possibility that genuine acceptance might reveal how much they have been missing all along. The avoidant dreads discovering that they have been living in emotional poverty when abundance was possible. This recognition would force them to confront years of self-imposed isolation and the pain they have caused themselves through their defensive strategies. The terror of being understood also involves their fear of having to reciprocate genuine intimacy. The avoidant knows that accepting authentic love creates an obligation to love authentically in return, which requires the very vulnerability they have spent their lives avoiding. They fear that they are incapable of giving love as deeply as they might receive it. Their nervous system cannot distinguish between the vulnerability required for authentic connection and the vulnerability that leads to emotional destruction. The avoidant experiences all forms of emotional openness as equally dangerous, making it impossible for them to differentiate between healthy intimacy and emotional suicide. The panic of acceptance becomes compounded by their fear that they might become addicted to genuine love once they experience it. The avoidant worries that if they allow themselves to be truly understood and accepted, they will become dependent on that experience and devastated if it ever ends. This fear keeps them trapped in emotional isolation, afraid to taste what they have always hungered for. Their psychological conditioning has taught them to expect rejection, criticism, and emotional inconsistency. When faced with someone who offers the opposite, their entire worldview becomes threatened. The avoidant cannot integrate genuine acceptance into their understanding of how relationships work, so they must either reject the love or reconstruct their entire belief system about human connection. The deepest terror lies in their fear that genuine acceptance might heal them, forcing them to abandon the familiar pain of isolation for the unknown territory of authentic connection. The avoidant has become attached to their emotional wounds and defensive strategies, viewing them as essential parts of their identity. The possibility of healing threatens to destroy who they think they are, leaving them without a coherent sense of self. This fear of transformation through love creates the ultimate avoidant paradox. They simultaneously crave and reject the very experience that could free them from their emotional prison. The terror of being truly understood and accepted keeps them locked in patterns of self-sabotage that guarantee they will never have to face the terrifying possibility of genuine happiness and authentic love, the existential fear of emotional annihilation. Deep within the avoidant's psyche lurks a primal terror that goes beyond simple fear of vulnerability or dependency, the overwhelming dread of complete emotional annihilation. This fear operates at the cellular level, where the avoidant believes that opening themselves to deep emotional connection will result in the total destruction of their identity, leaving them as nothing more than an empty shell consumed by another person's emotional needs and expectations. Their nervous system interprets emotional intimacy as an existential threat to their very survival. The avoidant's brain cannot differentiate between healthy emotional merger and complete psychological absorption. They fear that loving someone deeply will cause them to disappear entirely, dissolved into the other person's emotional world without any remaining sense of individual identity or autonomous existence. The physiological manifestation of this terror resembles a death response. Their body goes into shock at the prospect of emotional merger, with their nervous system shutting down non-essential functions to preserve core survival mechanisms. The avoidant experiences emotional intimacy as a form of psychological drowning, where they will be pulled under by the intensity of connection and never surface again as the same person. Their mind creates apocalyptic visions of what emotional intimacy might cost them. They imagine losing all sense of personal boundaries, becoming completely absorbed in another person's emotional reality, and having their own needs, desires, and identity completely overwhelmed by the relationship. These mental rehearsals of emotional obliteration become so vivid that they feel more real than the possibility of healthy interdependence. The terror of annihilation extends to their fear of becoming emotionally possessed by another person. The avoidant worries that deep emotional connection will allow someone else to control their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors completely. They cannot conceive of a form of intimacy that allows for individual autonomy within emotional closeness, seeing only the possibility of complete domination or complete isolation. Their psychological defense system treats emotional connection like a virus that threatens to infect and destroy their entire personality structure. The avoidant develops elaborate mental firewalls designed to prevent any emotional content from penetrating deeply enough to threaten their sense of self. This creates a constant state of internal warfare between their need for connection and their terror of dissolution. The fear of emotional annihilation becomes self-reinforcing as the avoidant interprets any signs of emotional merger as confirmation of their worst fears. When they begin to care deeply about someone, they experience this caring as evidence that they are losing themselves rather than as a sign of healthy attachment. This misinterpretation fuels their defensive responses and justifies their withdrawal from connection. Their sense of self becomes rigidly defined in opposition to emotional intimacy. The avoidant constructs their identity around what they are not rather than what they are, defining themselves primarily as someone who does not need others, does not depend on relationships, and does not lose control through emotional connection. This negative identity leaves them feeling empty and disconnected from any authentic sense of who they really are. The terror of annihilation also encompasses their fear that emotional intimacy will reveal the emptiness at their core. The avoidant worries that without their defensive structures, there is nothing substantial underneath. No real personality, no authentic desires, no genuine self-worth connecting with. They fear that emotional merger will expose them as fundamentally hollow beings who have been masquerading as complete individuals. Their nervous system remains in a constant state of high alert for any signs that their boundaries are dissolving or that they are becoming too emotionally invested in another person. This hypervigilance creates chronic stress and anxiety that further reinforces their belief that emotional connection is dangerous and must be avoided to maintain psychological survival. The deep-seated terror of abandonment after vulnerability. Perhaps the most crushing fear that haunts the avoidant is the terror of being abandoned precisely because they allowed themselves to become vulnerable. This fear operates as a double bind, where the avoidant believes that showing their authentic self will inevitably lead to rejection, yet they also fear that never showing their authentic self means living in perpetual loneliness and emotional isolation. Their psychological conditioning has created a twisted logic where vulnerability equals abandonment. The avoidant's mind cannot process the possibility that showing weakness, need, or emotional hunger might actually deepen connection rather than destroy it. They have learned to associate emotional openness with inevitable rejection, creating a mental framework where being truly known means being ultimately abandoned. Their nervous system responds to the prospect of post-vulnerability abandonment with the same intensity as a life-threatening emergency. The avoidant's brain interprets the possibility of being left after opening their heart as tantamount to emotional murder. This creates a physiological response so intense that they would rather live in emotional isolation than risk the devastating pain of abandonment after vulnerability. The terror of post-vulnerability abandonment becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, as the avoidance fear of rejection causes them to behave in ways that actually push people away. They become so terrified of being abandoned after showing their true self that they never allow anyone to see their authentic nature, creating the very isolation they fear most. This creates a cruel cycle where their attempts to avoid abandonment guarantee it. Their mind creates elaborate scenarios of rejection that feel more real than actual experiences of acceptance. The avoidant rehearses conversations where they reveal their deepest feelings, only to be met with disgust, laughter, or cold dismissal. These mental rehearsals become so vivid and frequent that they override any evidence of genuine acceptance or care from others. The fear extends beyond simple rejection to encompass their terror of being abandoned at their moment of greatest vulnerability. The avoidant imagines opening their heart completely, sharing their deepest fears and needs, only to have the other person use this information against them or walk away precisely because they showed their authentic self. This creates a psychological trap where intimacy itself becomes the enemy. Their emotional immune system treats vulnerability as a dangerous exposure that must be avoided at all costs. The avoidant learns to share only safe, superficial aspects of themselves, keeping their true thoughts, feelings, and needs carefully hidden. This creates relationships that feel hollow and unsatisfying, but also safe from the risk of devastating abandonment. The terror of abandonment after vulnerability creates a profound sense of existential loneliness. The avoidant realizes that no one truly knows them, because they have never allowed themselves to be fully known. This recognition creates waves of grief and despair as they understand that they are fundamentally alone by their own design. Yet they cannot risk changing this situation because the alternative seems even more terrifying. Their fear becomes compounded by their understanding that the deeper their vulnerability, the more devastating the potential abandonment. The avoidant recognizes that if they allow someone to see their deepest self, and that person then leaves, the pain would be unbearable. This creates a situation where the very depth of their capacity for love becomes a source of terror rather than joy. The psychological weight of carrying this fear affects every interaction and relationship in their life. The avoidant cannot fully commit to friendships, romantic relationships, or even family connections because they are always prepared for the inevitable abandonment. This constant emotional withdrawal creates a life of perpetual loneliness that they prefer to the risk of devastating rejection. Their nervous system remains hypervigilant for any signs that vulnerability might lead to abandonment. The avoidant monitors every reaction, every facial expression, every word for evidence that their openness has caused the other person to begin pulling away. This chronic anxiety creates a state of emotional exhaustion that makes genuine connection feel impossible even when opportunities arise. The terror of post-vulnerability abandonment also encompasses their fear of being abandoned not just by romantic partners but by friends, family members, and anyone else who might discover their true nature. The avoidant believes that their authentic self is so fundamentally flawed and unlovable that anyone who truly sees them will inevitably leave, creating a comprehensive fear of rejection that affects every aspect of their social and emotional life.